Hey there, listener. Welcome to the Deep Share Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rouse, and for the last couple of decades, I've slowly been opening my eyes to a very different world than the one I grew up hearing about. And the more conversations I have with interesting people, the more mystifying this world becomes. So without further ado, let's get deep.
We've got science to celebrate! Demons bliss out! After what, baby? Come on!
There is rebellion in the wind. It will be crushed.
Everything I've said is true. It's real.
Dinosaur fossils? God put those here to test our faith.
A damn lie. I saw them with my own eye.
Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away?
We did illusions, man! None of it is true!
I'm not insane!
This is mass madness, you maniacs! In God's name, you people are the real thing! We are the illusion!
It's not it's not the battle that people think it is at all. It's a completely different thing altogether, you know. It exists on such a different level. And
it's weird when you look at there's an Intersex documentary I saw a while ago, and it's funny because, well, not funny, it's tragic, but it's interesting that so many people who don't have hermaphrodite this is how it started. There were people, and there are people, and it's an increasing number. I think it's 5,000 children a day are born intersexed with hermaphroditic biology. And because in the 60s, I think Dr. Money was in the 60s or 70s, Dr. Money did but there was a botched circumcision of a child. And they said, well, he doesn't have a lot of options, as a boy without a penis, raise him as a girl. And so much of modern transgender ideology has to do with the fact that here's someone who they had a problem with, and they tried to change their gender to fix the problem instead of plastic surgery or something else. And it has nothing to do with the hermaphrodites. Like, so today people think, oh man, the transgender thing's ridiculous. Well, so much of the modern transgender thing has displaced the real issue of Pat, the Saturday Night Live character. There really are a lot of people like that. And imagine you're told 20 or 40 or 100 years ago, your child is not one or the other, then you're going to say, oh, they're one or the other. So we're only now finding out it's even more common, because it's only now that people will even admit it. Like the doctors wouldn't even put it on the paper originally. So there is a real thing there. There really is intersex and, hermaphrodites, and there should be more awareness and compassion for people that are living outside of the norm. But because of the transgender ideology, they're completely swept under the rug, and they're not.
Once again, it's that, trampling what's happening naturally to create like a mockery of it in public, maybe something to that degree, or I don't know.
I think it's definitely part of the fact that they are doing that, but it's also, it disguises and hides so much. I mean, because so many very important people, Akhenaten was most likely hermaphrodite.
Really?
There's a lot of evidence on the hips and the statues. It became a trend to make your statues of your leaders hermaphroditic, which also says, there's this idea of Hermes Trismegistus and Hermes Hermetics, and this whole thing is connected, hermaphrodite as well. So there's this idea of the dynamic being the royal. And even on a more weird level, like in the 20s, even in the 19th century, child actors, and there's castrato. So child actors would be turned into prepubescent for life. They would not be allowed to converge on puberty. And this would make it easier to have a man play a child role, or same with playing female roles in the Shakespearean courts. So there really was a huge amount of, and there always has been, transgendered theater people and transgendered politicians, and in the elite. Like, this has been a commonality for a long time. So it could also be connected to that, the idea of normalization.
It's really, it is a weird realm to think about. I mean, because you do have on one spectrum, no pun intended, you have that, what you were talking about before, the hermaphroditic situation that is common, it's historical, it's always been here, mixed with the opposite side of it, which is just so much parody of things, and again, just taking what's natural and vulnerable in some situations and using it as a shield that's what they do. they love doing that. And I say they very, very suspiciously, because of course I go, you said weird. I mean, on a weirder level, that's where I always am, because it's kind of all us. And when you were talking about that situation, it kind of made me think of alchemical, like one extreme and another creating this middle ground of some kind. We're always talking about extremes and then this middle ground. So it's kind of depends on what level of reality you're talking about it, right?
Well, it's interesting that the alchemical aspect is huge to it. You know, like they had Rosicrucians would switch hands from your right hand to your left hand about 30 years into your life. And they think that maybe Adolf Hitler's issues with Parkinson's were coming from the fact that he completely switched his brain trying to follow this Rosicrucian mind switching path. And alchemy comes up over and over again in terms of this idea of the human manifestation of the alchemical, of having that the male and the female soul within you. I mean, there's a lot of weird things there, though. A lot of the people that have been into that seem kind of evil, you know, over the centuries. But I would say, like, even on a completely, because I'd like to always be conspiratorial, but there's some natural, organic quality to that. Like I think you said that these things are happening in parody, and it's true. Like part of it is parody, but the reason is because it's so much easier to convince someone to use the same words differently. In legal circumstances, this is huge, you know, rather than make a new law or convince someone of a new idea. So you say intellectual property and online piracy. Well, we're talking about property and piracy, right? Because those are the things that are the most common understood international laws. So we'll create this idea that the internet is property, that the virtual is real. You know, virtual estate and real estate, that's a parody. That's literally what that is. But it makes it possible to keep using the law.
And yeah, I totally get what you're saying about, you know, keep it conspiratorial sometimes, because yeah, you never want to let your guard down. But and I probably get a lot of flack and get turned off by some people that where I look at both sides of this situation we have, this divide and conquer situation that's always existed. But then on every level of existence, this push and pull is happening. And how much of it do maybe our elites, quote unquote, or the cabal or whatever, know about that process that is just inevitable, and they're just taking advantage of it? So and when they show it to us, it's because, yeah, they have no reason not to, because either we're going to see it for ourselves eventually or not. But you know what I mean? It's out there regardless of them hiding it, because it's part of every level of reality. That got real weird, right?
Yeah. I mean, so this it's in terms of lies from politicians, you know, so often they lie. We've heard they lie, and we know propaganda and these things exist, misinformation campaigns,
of course.
But also another level is why they tell the truth. Because you look at, for instance, Biden saying, we're going to do all these things, we're super angry. And then the next day, his own press has to say, well, you know, it was a very emotional time, and he's not really going to break with treaties and start to commit war crimes. You know, and so many times when they say something that is not true and it gets caught up, then we've done what we've done to every politician. We say, okay, well, we can't trust what they say. And we have to understand that they don't trust the public. So if they're keeping the truth from the public, it's either because they think the public's divided into an oppositional public where there's the Russians versus us, or someone knowing it is going to hurt us in the long run. But that, you know, break that down further, the idea that knowledge can't be handled by the public, the truth can't be handled by the public, that eventually you'll object to the truth unless you're gradually guided towards the situation where you're like, well, I guess, you know, I have to do this, and that's the only thing that there is left to do. By that point, you've lost all your other, you know, perception of options. But there is a lot of truth in what they tell us because of that. They know that they can't continually do that and expect us not to completely. I mean, they can create reverse psychology, and that's a big control. But there's so many people that are still, you know, you have to imagine how insane it is. 70 million or whatever, 50%, 40 to 50% of the country may actually really be going with the program. I mean, it's scary to even fathom, but it's not just rigged elections. It's not just corruption. There are a lot of idiots. There really are, you know, people that are, and also idiot in the idiotai Athenian sense. Like there are absolved from politics and they are just controlled cogs in the machine. This is so much of why they tell us the truth. And so the truth is always minimal. You don't get the whole truth.
Right.
But this is why, I mean, recently Klaus Schwab was talking about resets and getting into Taran and Tartaria. And then I had an interview recently with Alexander Dugin and found out that they're talking about Tartaria. And it was like, okay, so nobody's hiding this anymore. 5 years ago, it might have even been, completely laughed at to mention this. And now it's just completely accepted at the World Economic Forum. Davos is talking about a renaissance of Tartary. Like, what is this, right?
Yeah. I also heard Putin, and maybe this is bad news, but I don't know. About a year ago, maybe less, I heard something about Putin talking about opening up some kind of library or presentation of some kind in honor of the lost Russians' true history, giving it back to the people of some kind.
There's been for years. So, I mean, I think it's 2008 when he stopped being president for about 4 years and Medvedev was president. There's a point in there where he's prime minister. And so this is maybe 2011 that they have a video of him being presented the maps of Tartary and saying, wow, we need to really start looking into this. As time's gone on, Tartary has become ubiquitous with Eurasia. As Dugin has mentioned this, but the thing that's the distinction is Russia considers itself the inheritor of Tartaria, not the original founders of Tartaria. They're the new foundlings.
Right.
There was a golden horde. There's a war. There's a bunch of people that have been pushed out. There's Eurasia had Taran, and you can see with we've talked about this in the last show, Tarkhan, Tarmax. There's a lot of things that use that root. And we at some point started calling Tartars Tatars Tatas in Persia because they didn't pronounce the R's. And there's also the difference between the D and the T. So Dada is actually another word for Tartar that we're finding in the Persian areas. But as time went on, Europeans in the West, after the Mongolian Pax, they start to refer to Tartaria as Tartaria because of the Tartarus. They think it's very similar to this idea of death and hell. But then even that is presupposition on the Greeks taking Taratian myths and saying, okay, well, these people who lived underground, they're actually evil. And it folds into Christianity. Then Tatar and is a kind of hybridization of the idea that there's a more Asian Tatar, there's a more Asian Eurasia, there's a more Eastern European, Scandinavian or Rus Eurasia. And so as time goes on, you see that in the 1800s, Tartarianism was just called Turanism. Toran was the Turkish, and they call it pseudo-Turkology, the idea that Jesus Christ was a Turk and everything. But if you get into this idea of what is a Turk and what is Istanbul and Constantinople and these connections, you actually find the term Turk is a little bit more general and actually has to do with this Ugaric language in its very usual language, not Sanskrit based. It has a completely different set of linguistic rules. So it's plausible in a lot of ways that the Turks were in charge for a time of this, but it's a milieu. It's a matrix of different communities that have all lived in this area. They've all interacted with each other, and they represent the land power. And so there's the Scythian versus the Tartarian. We've talked about this before, but really what it comes down to is this idea that there's the land empire, which is by tradition more traditional because it's working the land the way that they've learned how. And then the sea empire, which is by nature just more innovative because it has to overcome nature with technology, and it's constantly overcoming seasons and everything. So there really is a dynamic between traditionalism and modernism, even though that it's not the same as the dynamic between futurism. Because
I love your tongue twister fucking tweet that you put out the other day, where you were like, "Yeah, could you say something like that?" Like, what was it? You were like comparing all the isms, and it was great.
I want to have to read it. I want to get it. I kind of want to get it right if I do,
because it was great. It was pretty good because
it was like transhumanism is not posthumanism, and
posthumanism is not.
Yeah. Well, so I'll try to like explain it. Let me see if I can find it. So I think it actually was worth.
It was. I think it covered a lot in a cute little poem.
Aw. It's sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did it in Russian on VK because I figured that in Russia they don't actually talk about Will Smith or the Oscars at all.
That's great.
Which is pretty sweet. So I was pretty happy about that. Let's see. Traditionalism is different than nostalgism, and I'll say the whole thing and I'll explain what I mean. Traditionalism is different than nostalgism. Modernism opposes futurism. Futurism is not transhumanism. Transhumanism must be distinguished from posthumanism. Traditionalism and futurism both reject modernism. Modernism embraces contemporaneous customs, countercultures reject. So in a way, modernism is at odds with traditionalism and futurism because both of them are countercultures, and they're both saying we need to change everything about the modernity. So there's a lot more of a unity between the past and the future than there is, for instance, between the left and the right in modernity. And the modernity is the thing that's fighting to keep itself in checks or in power. So you have people might think that there's this great huge war going on between Ukraine and but really it's just a war between the land and the sea power and trying to maintain unipolarity because they're so desperate to stay in charge and they know that they're losing everything that they're willing to work with their enemies just to proliferate the system. And also transhumanism is a different thing because so many people hate transhumanism, but really it's just this idea of Alzheimer's being replaced. But posthumanism, very quickly, once you start saying we're going to just extend the human condition as far as it can go and remain human, right? Like by making sure kids who have missing limbs, you give them new limbs or something like that. That's a transhumanist idea.
Yeah, let it be a stepping stone to our future, not the future.
Yeah, if you become non-human, as soon as you step out of in any way, when you're like, I can't make choices the same way, I can't think the same way, certain amounts of neural link will do this, where you're no longer the same kind of human. That becomes post-humanism, and that's at odds with transhumanism as well. So,
man, that's crazy. And I'm glad that you brought up to not bring up the Will Smith thing. I was very tempted to make a meme that was like every other theory on Chris Rock's face and then put root language on the slap because I've been obviously dug into a lot of language stuff, and I know that you dig on that stuff too, and tying it into where these hidden cultures come from, perhaps. Like I always kind of have seen it as these two groups of some kind that I'm always trying to pinpoint, like who started this divide and conquer, or maybe it's one group and they can't figure it out, but it's more complex than that, it seems. Or I don't know, maybe it's this original, it's always one, then it breaks to two, and then from there it's chaos because it'll continue to divide into different ideologies. I don't know, where do you fall with that, with the all the interesting mythologies coming out of that part of the world?
Well, there's definitely nationalism becomes a major player in any story. So I think we talked last time a bit about Beowulf and the connections between Scandinavian mythology, which are very much their own, but also they're inspired in a lot of ways by Hellenistic. Yeah, it's pretty clear that they're inspired by Hellenistic concepts. I mean, the lightning throwing god and this and that. There are seriously close connections. Not everybody in barbaric Scandinavia went to Rome, but clearly there were intellectuals that interacted. And you see the same thing with Roman mysticism and the Aeneid coming from Homer's Odyssey. They're very connected concepts. So what will happen often is somebody will say, we are now in charge of this empire, which is, what is an empire? It's a garden. You have gardeners that are growing food, you have growing people, growing doctors, and then it's continually running. So it's a farm, right? But if you don't keep watering it, it'll die. And if somebody else comes along when you die and take it over, it becomes theirs. So there really is a connection between the actual empire itself. It's the house with many masters. The masters are revolving, throughout the generations, and they will come in and say, well, we need to make these stories about us. So a lot of the time the stories will change. You'll still keep some of the story, but the character will become more like the new people in charge. And also there's, history perspective changes as well. So maybe right now we're looking at Tartaria through the lens of our current civilization. But if we were to look at it, the same information 500 years ago, we thought of it as, or 300 years ago, we thought of Tartaria as magic. Now we see it as science. Who knows what we'll see it like in 300 years. So we constantly have to revisit history. I do think, though, the idea of the land and sea power are very dynamic. I mean, the difference between being traditionalist and being modernist or futurist is huge. If you think of, Carthage and Rome, the first war crimes were, that we know of, were elephants. Like the first weapons of mass destruction were elephants of mass destruction, right? And they would bring them in, and they would smash people's heads, and they would stampede. There was a couple times, though, where they made a bunch of noise or something, and the elephants went backwards. They're like, and they killed their own armies. So everyone's like, all right, that's it. No more elephants. This is just brutal. This is carnage in Carthage.
Right.
But a couple centuries later, after invading in the north, Hannibal invaded in the north in Italy. The Romans started using elephants. They made everyone sign these war treaties against elephants, and then they started using them themselves when it became more natural, when it had been tried. And we see this with China, and everyone's always like, wow, China doesn't experiment enough. Well, maybe that's because they're not really the sea power. And what is America and England? It's this, we have this island thing that's not very much in resources or land. Now, there's a respect to England and the UK for what they do have, but they have to control so much other of the world to maintain the hegemony, to maintain themselves as their power, having a great British pound sterling that's better than the other economies. It requires exploitation of the rest of the world, colonization. This requires the seafaring power. So the seafaring power is, I think, a very different thing than the land-bearing power. But at the same time, the land and sea powers are doing the same thing. The Romans were in 60 AD in Britain. 1066, you have the bottoming manumissions. You go back 1,000 years earlier, they're still slaves. To this day, to be a king and queen of England, it seems like the rule is you have to prove your lineage comes from outside of England, right? You know what I mean? Because if you were a native Pocahontas kind of Aboriginal, but of England, like I think they're the what do they call them? There's the name for that.
I don't know.
The gypsies in England have another name. Gypsies, travelers. Forget what they're called.
You'll say it, and I'll know it too, but I don't know.
Oh man,
it's not the
friends or something like that.
I don't know that.
The travelers. There's so many names.
Interlopers. I don't know.
Fellows. Oh man. The thing is, there's people mix up the Romani, and
that's what I was thinking.
in England, they think that all the gypsies are Romani, but there's actually another group that are the travelers, and I forget there's another name for them as well. But they are, as far as we can tell, the most Aboriginal English people. They're people that have been there the longest, and it stands up to the hierarchy rules of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and also how Columbian and pre-Columbian civilization has worked, and caste systems in India, which also have made their way through the Moors and the Arabs into Spain and Portugal, which is where we get our word for classism, is from the caste system.
Right. Yeah.
So caste systems are essential, but to this whole myth of, hierarchy, but we have these people who they were first there and then they get exploited. So looking at other examples, because England's history has been so erased, we look at South America and you see that the mestizos, and the mulattoes, and then the Castillos, and then the Europeans. So the Europeans are the furthest removed. They're at the very top of the pyramid. And then they have a group of partially European people that have also been mixed with people from another place that have been already conquered. So they have the mulattoes. And then the mulattoes are above the mestizos. And so as you get further down, the lower you go, the more native and more Aboriginal your people are. So the people that are there, they have to have all of their rights removed. But if you're from there and you get sent to go conquer for your leading country some other people, you will have slightly more rights as a mercenary in a new culture. And so this continually happens where the mercenaries they think they have the highest privilege, right? And so this is where people get so upset at European Americans, like, well, you had the highest privilege. Well, not really, because clearly they're still working. You know, if you look above that, there's a group of people that are above that, and they're not interested in being American or being English at all. In fact, it looks like you have to prove that you come from Muhammad or from Solomon or, you know, somewhere else, you know, clearly in order to run any one of these countries, and not just England. Germany's royal houses, you know, nobody's from their own place. So it's not just that you have to be from another place, that you have to be from the specific family. It's also that the country cannot be ruled by someone who's actually invested in its future. That's scary.
Yeah, that really is very interesting and telling. Where's Zelensky from? Is he from Ukraine? Was he born and raised there?
So Zelensky's so in Ukraine is such a weird idea, because it's this idea of like, it is a
conglomerate area.
Yeah, it is a country, like Iraq's a country, and like, but you know, for 1,000 years, there was the Russian areas, there's the Polish areas. He's from the Russian areas, but he's Jewish. So the background on where his family came before they got to the east of Ukraine, I'm not completely sure, but I know he speaks Russian, and his television show was in Russian, and they're trying ideologically to make Ukrainians more Ukrainian by speaking Ukrainian, but Ukrainian and Russian, you know, they're pretty similar. There's a difference there. A lot of the time, the snobs of Russians think that Ukrainian is just slurring Russian, because it removes some of the vowels and the sounds, right? Kiev becomes Kiev and things like that. So it's not impressing the Russian Ukrainians, who are still nationalistically, some of them are still nationalistically Ukrainian. A lot of people don't want to be part of Putin's Russian Federation, and it can still be Russian. So that's the other thing. Not everyone in the Russian parts of Ukraine are pro Russia, but at the same time, a lot of Ukrainians, you know, they might not tell you at this point because of nationalism and because they get arrested for it, but they might not be super enthusiastic about the government of Zelensky either. I mean, it's a weird thing to happen. Imagine you're Ukrainian and there's a TV show about this guy who is a teacher, you know, he's a high school teacher who talked to me like I'm 5, you know, and he yells, and it starts out like, I don't know if you've seen the show, but it's
just a preview.
The whole first season's on Netflix. The second season I found on YouTube. You have to type it in Ukrainian or Russian, but you can find it. And if you go on the Xirtus.com and you go to my chat groups, I have links to all those if anyone's trying to watch the English translations of these shows. And I'll do a better deep dive at some point where I actually record some of the scenes and string them together. But essentially,
that'd be sick, because I want to know about, like, I definitely want to dive into it for sure. So go ahead.
It's a weird thing to like read TV. I get it. It's like either read a book or don't you? But I mean, if you really want to study mind control and monarch programming and Mockingbird style Tavistock, MK Ultra propaganda, and you wonder why American television is so just bad, and why they don't have anybody but Wanda Sykes to do your, you know, talk, because all their best people are over there working in other countries on propaganda for the other countries they're taking over. Wow. This show is amazing. This show has Curb Your Enthusiasm, West Wing, Spin City, That's My Bush, all rolled into Roseanne. There's a lighting at the beginning with the family, and they're literally wearing the same outfits. You're like, this is Roseanne. And he lives with his mother, and they're all living in this apartment. But the YouTube, somebody catches him on video yelling about all the problems in Ukraine one day.
Like Jeff Daniels.
And then he wins the popular vote, which I think there's a Chris Rock movie, right? Isn't there a Chris Rock movie where he literally does that?
Something like that,
exact same thing.
Yeah.
And so, but it's exactly the same story. He's driving buses. He's not getting, you know, and he gets rid of his limos and his bodyguards, doesn't need them, he says. And, you know, the whole thing is just so absurd, but he'll continually say, okay, why did this not work? I'm going to try to fix it. Why did the last 8 governments not make it happen? And he'll break down, well, this guy stole the money, doubled the money. This guy stole the money, doubled the money, all the way down. And they never paid the union of workers. So they're selling the metal scrap pile so they can feed their kids. And they said they would love to finish it in a month and stop doing that as soon as someone pays them, because they haven't been paid in 6 months. And this is the continual story of the haphazard, issues, and everyone's got these corruption and bureaucrats so he comes through, he cleans it all up gradually, except there's still this prime minister behind the president who's not trustworthy. And at the end of the show, he, catches him in the act. And but that's just, as time goes on, more and more problems happen. The second season, he has a time when the European Union accepts the Ukraine, and he wakes up the next morning and everyone's gone. And it's this, and the whole place is just empty. And he rides a bike around, and his beard grows like Castaway, and he has a coconut like Wilson, and he's just in Ukraine by himself. And then Angela Merkel calls him, and he's ducks in the White House, and he's just like, get out of the way, get out of the way. And he's like, answers her, and he's like, you've done an amazing job with Ukraine. Crime is lower than any other country in Europe. There's no, population problems. You might need to work on your population growth a bit by bringing in some refugees or immigrants. But other than that, it was just like, so they say a lot.
My goodness.
They say a lot in the show, but those are just like the fun ones that are trying to show you, because the first episodes are, we're going to clean up the country and how it's going to happen, which literally led to a party being named after the TV show Party, and him being put in charge of the country as the president, the actor who played the character. So it's the levels. I mean, I guess I've said it, but it just doesn't, it's still hard to process that this is really real, that you could literally do this, that people said, yeah, I want to have that sitcom be real. I'm voting.
Oh, dude,
for this
remember
sitcom.
how many memes did you see? Jon Stewart for president, like back in the day. It's, you rally around icons.
He might have been able, if he hadn't been so, I mean, God forbid me like giving people credit, but if he had sold out just a little bit more, he would have been president, I think. Right. I mean, probably. Like, if he had just not talked about Ron Paul, at all, then he probably he could have been. But
he could have. Yeah, you never know. That's fucked up, man. Yeah, I wonder, like, it's propaganda on one level, it's mind control on one level, and then again, like these deeper level, or maybe kind of taking a bigger step back and looking at it, it's just, it feels like reality is constantly mimicking itself into existence. And
totally,
do you think that Zelensky having this shit happen, is this just the height of arrogance of what they can get away with, or do you think it's more than that?
I mean, I don't think it's, I think it's, maybe it's arrogant, but really I think it's kind of, I hate to say, it's kind of brilliant, because you've got these people.
Well, fair. Yeah. But you know what I'm saying? Like, does this, like,
it's necessary at this point because we've moved into postmodernism, and that's a good thing in some ways. So objective truth didn't exist when Socrates was voted to be poisoned by a democracy.
Right.
Objective truth never really exists. And the knowable truth is not the eternal truth. Someone said it better recently, that if you're talking about the Tao, you don't know the Tao, or something like that.
Well,
because it is.
That's perfect, because they also say, when you think quantum physics, you actually have no idea. It's very similar in that regard. You're messing with this thing that kind of can't be named. It can kind of only be like slightly taken in.
But you can manifest your reality
around it. Yes.
Way more powerful than truth itself often. I mean, it depends. Truth can, in certain circumstances, destroy a facade. But I don't know. I'd like to do some math on that, because I kind of feel like it's more that the revealing of the mistruth, or the absence of function of the mistruth, is the issue, not that truth itself is helping. And this is sad, because I want it to be, but I don't think I see evidence of truth existing objectively. So it's more that you say, hey, this thing you've been relying on, can't rely on it anymore.
I totally agree. There's no, I often use Russian dolls in symbolism and metaphors, because that's how I feel reality kind of is built in that fractal form. But also it's also the onion, because you're literally digging through and suddenly you're on the other side and you're like, what the fuck? Where was the thing? There was no thing. There's never a thing. You know what I mean?
You're Mr. Magoo. And so as long as you can't see where you're going, you're fine, you know. But as soon as you start to rely on something, that step gets a little bit more creaky until it snaps. And so in regards to the show, though, like the idea is
Sure.
to create a truth or a reliable presupposition for people to exist upon. So the Daison, so the spirit, so this idea that, okay, what is Ukraine? Well, Ukraine's kind of like an old America. We're watching syndicated American TV. We're going to start the show with Roseanne lighting and Roseanne set because we feel like an old America. And then we're going to move into other shows that we've seen, and we're going to show you how that works. And if you parallel it back to how Spin City and West Wing were used in the United States to convince people, I mean, part of the deal is getting the opposite audience of people that you would want to hang out with. If you're a television producer, you're probably trying to hit the other group of people because you could just talk to your friends. So the more powerful thing is to make it, as a liberal, to make a conservative show so that conservatives will believe in the show. And then you can every once in a while put in this thing about the world looks a certain way to Americans. Look at the Chinese map instead of the American map. Look at the actual size of continents. These are things that the Republicans wouldn't have been, and the particularly American Midwest conservatives who had been ascribed to Republicans, even though Republicans and Democrats switch hats every few generations. So you start to see like there's this plan to control the opposition through media. And Ukraine has done this spectacularly. You have this Spin City president who's coming out like Michael J. Fox, and he's running around saying, that he's going to make the country great again. And by the way, this is all happening before the show came up before Trump was president. So another interesting thing, so much of the narrative is if it's so close to what people thought Trump was doing. This idea that he's helping and getting rid of trafficking, laundering, et cetera, only, and even that the media is against it because the media is tied in with the corruption and everything else. So there's a lot of parallels between what happened in America in 2016 and this show that eventually got him elected, I think, in 2019. But you also hear every once in a while these predictive lines like, everybody quiet down, listen. And they're not listening. He says, Putin's been disposed, and then he's like, that works every time. I'm sorry, I have to, that's the only way to get your attention. And he'll do that like throughout the show. They continually bring up this idea. And then there's an episode of I think the first episode of the second season is that he's being attacked and going through like a Hunger Games like scenario. The revolution's coming, airstrikes are coming, Ukraine's going to be invaded. And then it turns out it's just a ritual hazing for his birthday. So there's a lot of weird things in the show that reveal a lot about what's going on with the Ukraine conflict. And I need to probably at some point get a better translation for the last few episodes of the second season. But you can see like the plan was to show that Ukraine's going to clean up, Ukraine's going to remove all of these people in power, that this is going to be a way for the Ukraine to become stable without joining the EU. The dangers of joining the EU are we'll lose our people and we'll have to bring in people that aren't Ukrainian, and that there's this huge nationalism. The Tomga symbol is in every scene. When they're kissing, he's put his hand up on the shield of the Ukrainian Tomga. It's the most nationalistic show I've seen since the 30s in Germany.
That is nuts. And I was thinking that it was kind of nurtured by American bureaucrats this whole time already anyway. So it's like they're recreating it over there. And they do that often in history. That's kind of their nom de plume. That's kind of what they do. They just go around and recreate what they've already done in other places, right? And how different is that from when we were finding pyramidal structures in the past in multiple different locations? And now it's seemingly getting more and more clear what these things were used for on some sort of electrical level, or, on a very personal level for everyone involved in the area and shit like that. Who knows? I don't know.
There's even pyramids in Ukraine. I forget the complex in, where is this one at? I'm trying to find the name of it. It's so hard. It's like it's in Lugansk. In Lugansk, if you look for the Lugansk Ukrainian pyramids, you'll see that there's mountainous pyramids. And
Interesting.
it's also areas where I think we maybe went into this last time. Everywhere we found star forts for Tartaria, we're very close to volcanoes so far.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's not that huge of a discovery, mind you, because there are volcanoes everywhere. But it is weird that where there also are star forts everywhere, and when they're nearby these areas, the mineral content goes up. Amazing how if you're a star fort, you'll be near a place where there's a volcano, uranium sometimes, and silver or gold or whatever. I mean, so that's I'm scared even to mention that, so because people could use that to find out other interesting things. It's true. Like well, Ukraine, go for it. Yeah, but Ukraine's got the radiation, but it's got and not in the petroleum propaganda sense, but it has the minerals and resources and materials that 5 times any other country in the region nearby. So they have a crazy amount of I think it's 5% of the world's uranium, or maybe it's oil reserves or whatever. They have so much of so many things, and you go to other places, it's not as big of a problem. So it makes sense that this would be the cradle of civilization, because if there is a reset and it's coming out of, but it's not to say that Ukraine is the only one. It just seems like Ukraine might have been one that didn't break down the longest, because you look at Krakatoa, you look at Can't Be Figured, they all broke down. Ukraine didn't break down for a very long time. And it was the epicenter for Chernobyl, which was this sort of future city. Russia wanted to have everyone in the world was going to have a zeitgeist Venus project like paradise based on Chernobyl. Chernobyl, and this is kind of in a weird way proves it to me. You find out that Sahara before it meant desert, like lush rainforest or something to that effect. But now we think Sahara means desert. Right. You find out that Chernobyl used to mean the exact opposite of, now you think it means radioactive dystopia. That's the perfect rebranding of paradise. They've taken the original word Chernobyl and everything had to refer to, where like the angels met the seraphim. And it's a divine place. Like there's a very beautiful thing. But now this is the same with Tartaria, Tarnation. Like they just completely flip a word on its head, and to flip it on its head, that's different than even the Russians took the McDonald's and made Gigi Bella, which is they put the McDonald's on its side, but it's not upside down like a tarot card.
And that's almost more important. That's like a very symbolic thing that it's not, rather than almost what it means the way it is. The way it's not is important there, that inversion's always there. And you brought me to where I love going, which is the biggest one in my opinion. It's hell, Hel. And Udenma, that whole thing from the Box Saga, and this whole cradle of civilization in paradise at the North Pole, possibly. What's your perspective on that? Because I know it's not just the Box Saga. It's not just Finnish mythology talking about that. We have other ideas coming to us about this magnetic mountain in the north and everything. Where do these roots or possible roots fit in?
So in terms of the Box Saga, like I think we were talking last time about how important it's so important. Like the Box Saga,
we said that. We didn't say really why. So
we could. I mean, we kind of. Yeah, you're fair. It's fair. All right. The idea that language, roots, and symbolism of sounds, like why is cough such a strong sound? What's the deal with that? And as time goes on, why do certain sounds get flipped on their heads? Why is it that Tartar became Tata, or why maybe was it Dada originally? Why is Berber and Barbar? Like the sound shapes actually affect our complete understanding of everything on every level. But it's not just the single pole. Like this idea of the multipolarity is important. Like there are a number of poles according to the ancient myths, and Thule in the north and like the Hyperborean north, there's a lot of stories that connect the Santa Claus and the Krampus and the underground beings that were Hellenistic, and they're not good, they're not bad, they're tricksters, and if they're upset, they might destroy you because they're more powerful than you. It's a very different.
Sounds like any human that feels more powerful than any other human.
Yeah, it's true, but also, I mean, it's a god mass. It's like that. Yeah, I guess so. It's a very anthropic way of looking at things, is that humans can be dangerous and therefore gods could be like humans. Bali have their religious, they have clowns that come out and they try to make the gods laugh because they figure that way they won't. If the gods get too upset, they might destroy humans for their own amusement. But if we keep making them laugh, maybe then that'll be fine. And it's interesting because that's a very similar idea to Loki and Seth and these connections. That Seth was a foreign god, that Loki was considered to be a foreign god. There are serious connections between the polar Hyperborean Scandinavian beliefs and the Balinese beliefs. And there's another, possibly why Frisians from Holland ended up there, because they were probably already there before the reset and going back and forth. But the other thing is, we were talking about Hellenism and
Hellenism. Yeah.
Yeah. So people thought, you know what, that Greek stuff, that's bad. You know, getting close to God, you think God's the sun? No, that's the devil. Get away from that. You know, or that, you know what, underground is that's bad, because it was good. And it stands to logic so much of, if this is considered to be the absolute evil, that at one point it was flipped on its head, right, because of somebody else. And no one's flipping it on its side and saying, well, what is this really about? But there's this idea of like Heliorchus and Heliorca and these sun orchestrated cities that were run by the sun, or solar powered autonomous cities that have wind and water power as well, that are connected to these star forts.
Wow. Yeah.
And we translated later to say, wow, how magical, because during the Pax Mongola and the periods when there's a disconnection because the volcanoes have erupted and just some sort of destruction has happened, people don't know what this technology is, so they're just saying to themselves, oh wow, you know, this was magical. But there it is. There's the evidence all along the way that in Hellenism as well, you see like the Alexandrian steam engines and the solar photovoltaic chemicals, and all of these groups that are trying to figure out ways of doing the shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
You know, using different chemicals to do photolight exposure and everything. There's so many groups that are trying to figure this out, up until Vermeer does his lens painting. And then all of a sudden the chemistry starts to become understood again. So we kind of have records of everyone going their separate ways and fighting with each other and never figuring out what they're looking at. You know, you have a group that says, hey, this is all the most important stuff we understand. But it'd be kind of like if there was a desert island, or there was a plane crash or something like that, in 4 different islands from one company. Like, let's say Apple or something crashed into 4 different places, and the teams that worked on making the software were on one island, and the teams that built the hardware were on another island. So they don't understand everything, but it's so important, and they know it, that they generationally save that wisdom as almost religion. And then eventually someone built a bridge, and then they're like, wait, your culture, our culture, they just work so well together. And that's when you start to see it's because they come from the same thing, but they were specialists.
It's interesting too, because it almost reminds me of the Tower of Babel in that way, how it's just this unified thing that gets broken apart, and it can come back together. Perhaps maybe that's why our language has been so deeply, like, it feels like a trick almost when you start getting into all the word magic, which comes from puns, which is, you know, I guess kind of taken in as like the lowest form of humor. Isn't that interesting? It's demonized, yet it's like the phonetics of it all is what can root it all back together.
I've also felt it was strange when I did my interview with Dugan, because he's Russian and he speaks like 6 languages or more. The words he's using and how he describes them, I understand them because I took classes on those words. So when he says political theory or capitalism or usury or license, you know, like in the Black's Law Dictionary, license is the ability or the permission to do what you would otherwise not be allowed to do. These have definitions, and it's like hocus pocus in Harry Potter. But then the comment section, there were some people that were very upset because they go back into, well, I think that the word means, and my common usage matters, right? And no, like common usage matters only to the degree that you're speaking amongst the common masses. But if you're talking about actual definitions of words, etymological definitions, accepted definitions are where we're at. There's the academic accepted definition, and then there's the etymological definition, and the common usage is almost always wrong.
Yeah.
So
Do you think we're heading back towards a place where, I mean, because it seems like in every aspect, at least from our limited bias perspective in this community of open-minded thinkers, we are just uncovering everything from the past. So do you think we're possibly maybe getting back to a more pure language at some point? Or do you think newspeak and this, everything that's happening to our language is to stop that from inevitably happening, perhaps?
I think that there's a dynamic here between, this idea of traditionalism and futurism come into language again. If everyone has universal language, then on one hand, they will be understood, but on the other hand, they'll have nothing new to talk about. So the difference of miscommunication is very important, and the difference of perspective is essential. So we need people to see things different ways, to have different feelings about the outcomes of a story. Someone should believe the exact or feel the exact opposite about Beauty and the Beast as you do. Everything should be flipped. They should be on the side of the noble royal who's a primal beast, and except we need to have people that exist in that sense. But we also need language to evolve. So when people talk about their problems with neural links, my problem with Neuralink is mainly the idea that it might end language. We're getting to a point where you'll be able to send an experience of sensory experience to someone else. You'll lose the meta tags. They won't have reference. And so language is important so that we're able to describe an experience without having to share the experience, learning the easy way instead of learning the hard way. You don't have to believe the lesson. You can choose whether you live by that lesson in your life's dharma or not. But otherwise, we become fully homogenized. And I think that's the biggest scare right now, is if we lose the capacity to now here's an optimist's other side. The optimist paradox is that more neural link experiences might mean more understanding of experience, which could lead to, if it's left in check and not post-humanist, might allow people to create more meta tags of experiences, creating more words and better understanding of words. So that would be cool, but you have to be careful that don't always expect the best.
Well, of course, it always goes back to intent and who's behind this tech and who's running it. I mean, because it's not technology that's the bad guy. That's the funny thing about Terminator, my favorite action movie from the 90s, and it makes so much sense now. Hoping I'm kind of raising a little John Connor right now, but not to the extent where he wouldn't pick up the damn machine and use it for his own goodwill. I always say that technology has always and should always, the word itself, etymological definition and probably the academic definition, both together, can be used as a tool to help us get where we're going. Always, but and it will change. The shape of it will change. The look of it will change. But technology is not where the enemy is. It's always about intent, right?
Those elephants. So,
but they were provoked, right, to act that way.
But there's chaos. There's always chaos. Something could happen. They were startled by noise, and the noise startled them. So you got to be careful with the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Of course.
So it's not always about intentions. It's sometimes about feedback loops of consequence. And I think that's.
So it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, and that's kind of where we've been, where our heads have been in this conversation, where it's there are these polarizing forces in this experience we're having on a political, every level we could talk about. And it's not one or the other, and it's not neither. It's both. It's both of these forces working in balance. And I'm not hate, but it's very upsetting that it seems like these universal concepts are so embedded in a fearful negative way sometimes in supposedly more open-minded communities. And I don't like that the concept of certain symbols get wrapped in and the baby thrown out with the bathwater a lot of times. And maybe we're moving past that. Maybe I'm a broken record at this point,
No,
Maybe
I
people are,
agree. I think that there are people that agree with us, but it is still startling that we're looked at as as the counterculture and not accepted that the counterculture is usually the thing that usurps the dying culture. I mean, of
always.
course, Rome, Christianity, Constantinianism, like all these ideas, they were rejected and then they were embraced and assimilated and became ubiquitous. So clearly the counterculture has to rise, but there is that struggle. And I think eventually we'll come up with the most poetic way of saying that there's a struggle between modernity on both ends, between futurism and traditionalism, and that is actually the war right there, is on every respect, is that the traditionalists and the futurists need to work together, because otherwise the other two will destroy the other. So if modernity works with traditionalism, it will destroy futurism. If modernity works with futurism, it will destroy tradition.
It's interesting how you put that. It's not the same frame at all, but just it sounded like the rich working with the poor won't destroy the middle class. Hey,
that's
Russian doll, my friend.
That's a theory I'd like to explore as well. I think the Bell economy was the creation of the rich working with the middle class. So, or the poor rather. The Bell economy, the middle class was created on the poor working with the rich.
What do you know about the Bell? I only got turned on to that very recently. Just the concept of it came across my plate by looking something else up. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay. The Bell economy is the idea that you need to have a certain amount of wealth in the middle class. You have the rich have to pay in financial capitalism and usury just enough that the middle class can continue to buy. And there's a large enough middle class that the middle class is large enough to continue to buy the things that the poor are being paid enough to become the middle class in order to sell. So there's a relationship between the poor and the rich, and what develops is this bell in between, and it expands. And so the expansion is more wealth to the poor and less wealth to the extreme rich, but only so much less and only so much more until there's a sweet spot. And the sweet spot was, as far as people described, in the 40s to the 70s, and the 19th century, it was theorized as a thing, but I'm going to explain why I don't really believe in the full explanation for this. Sure. The Bell economy was credited as being a capitalist or financial capitalist marvel, but it's an economic miracle of managerial theory that arrived because the rich knew that the other option was complete collapse of industry. What's happening now with the collapse of the Bell economy, the collapse of the middle class, is there's less people to buy these goods. Therefore, there's less multi-millionaire, there's less mass sales of objects. So the billionaires start to be less and less billionaires, and the poor end up getting paid less because there's less demand for the poor to work to make these products to compete with each other. Because really what ends up happening is everyone's making a car prices go down, prices for work goes up because they want you to work for them. And then more and more cars get made so they can sell as many cars as possible. And then the middle class are created from, so this is how we think of the middle class. The problem is the middle class existed before. Also in Roman and theoretical Rome, you have this idea of socialized monster truck shows. You have the Colosseum, you have wine and bread for free. And it's all coming from the expansion of the sea power. So you could say that it's capitalism. It's probably not. It's probably the imperial value of expansion, because the exploiting of these new places, for instance, Tunisia, South Africa, they continually bring more and more wealth to a place. And if you have a populace that could riot, then you continually pacify them. So there, on one side, there's that. On the other, but you can maybe find someone who's older than me who lived in the 50s and ask them about the differences between the Bell economy in the 50s and what it's like now. And they'll tell you it's very different, because there are certain things that are the same. For instance, a lot of people still aren't dying. A lot of people still have roofs over their heads, but they're state-owned roofs or they're state-controlled roofs. They're not the same kind of roofs. Movies have lost quality. There's more content, but there's less
Oh
quality.
man, yeah.
And so everything is shifted to a subsidy of this system, so that people don't notice all that's lost, all that they had that's gone. Well, yeah, you still got Disney Plus, but your theater. Remember what theaters were, with gold statues of Babylonian goddesses with breasts, and theaters not what they used to be for a nickel, you know?
Yeah. Wow, it's kind of disheartening when you think about it that way. But at the same time, the way you were kind of describing how that kind of economy has the potential to work, it almost gives me a little bit more of a perspective on this like delicate balance, right? That maybe at least they assume or think that they're trying to uphold, and they have it on their shoulders, maybe in some regard, maybe some perspectives. It almost felt like you were describing some sort of toroidal movement, that just kind of worked and kept working and kept growing. That's really interesting, because I remember hearing Jim Chesner talking about a monetary system. I don't know if he was speaking directly. He wasn't talking about like the Acer people from the very beginning or anything, but like at some point in ancient history, talking about how the king would hand out coins and they would have his face on it, but they would go around and circulate as currency, literally keep things moving. But then those coins for that year would be turned in at the end, and new coins would be minted for the next year. And the process would continue, but no wealth would be garnered by individuals by, personal intentional acquisition,
I mean, there's a beautiful hope in that, maybe.
Right, maybe.
But here a couple of things. Like, one is they would have to pay out to people a lot because the government had debt. And so they would put their faces on coins. And that way you could expect that money would circulate in that kingdom, because otherwise it would get re-stamped by the next generation when they were re-stamping money. The big problem was, before Archimedes, people would take their money and shake it in these bags for good luck, and then the powdered edges of the gold smashing each other would fall into the bag, and you have a pile, gram of gold. So the money would start to lose off the edges. So Archimedes invented this thing where they have around the quarter, you have that like those lines, the indentation, and that's how it's a full. It hasn't been none of the metal has been lost from the original coin. So a number of tricks of the trade that were used in order to keep that money in circulation. But the main thing was that money in the kingdom was represented by the value of the sovereign and what sort of wealth the state was in charge of. So we also confused taxes with social services. At one point, social services were not from taxes. They were from, like we said, the elite going out and finding spoils of war and then compensating the locals with those spoils of war. We did this in the 60s with McDonald's getting potatoes for cheaper in South America. It became very cheap to go to McDonald's because hamburger from Argentina and potato from Bolivia was, it was a lot cheaper than getting it from Washington State. This sort of expansionism benefits the middle class up until there's no one else to rob. And that's kind of always been, the left have talked about that for a long time, but it's in a weird way important, because that's why globalism exists, in order to make sure that no one else has the capacity to get a cheaper product. The problem with it is it ends up that no one's able to make anything after that point. There's no more competition. When was the last time you saw a competitive business? At this point, they've already brought the prices down on everything, and the entropy is so low anyway that we're looking at the next step is, how do you continue to keep something functioning when the society starts to collapse? Do you need 1 million new vehicles a year? No, but you probably still need some trucks every year, or else the society will collapse. So we're starting to see the minimalization of everything because of the collapse of the bubble economy.
So we often talk about the elites, or whatever we want to call them, the parasite class. They research everything, they predict everything, they know what they're doing. Everything is so thought out, seemingly on every level of everything. You'd think that they would be able to turn the dial forward and see the future that you're talking about. And if keeping the society going in one way or another has kind of always been what they need to do, even if they don't want to. I don't know. Doesn't it seem like they're committing suicide as well? Like what is happening in their future model? Or is it just they're going to live forever because they're going to be cyborgs or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the level of psychopathy close to that.
Okay.
Actually. I mean, so many people know that the future is coming and they latch onto the future and they forget about living in the present. And so there's all these books like Be Here Now, that's Be Here Now.
Hell yeah.
But then there's people that say nostalgically that the past was so great that we want to go back and we want to do things like they did in the past. Never mind that, they beat women, or that, you could, it was only good if you're one color,
right.
But that,
or like
was,
1 out of 10 kids, not 1 out of like 100 kids survived at one point.
Yeah. Right. And to define survive, because it's 30, 20. Right. So
goes back to that perspective, man. Doesn't care. People in India have nothing, right? We're fine. Sorry to interject, but yeah, it's that exactly. Ram Dass thing,
So it makes me, but I mean, and I wouldn't really critique it so hard with you, other than to say that I agree that being here now might not always be the only thing that matters. I've seen some people be here now and miss tomorrow, and not and sleep through yesterday and then they miss tomorrow. So being here now might not be the way to go all the time. Sometimes you have to be aware of the future and the past. So it seems like they're saying we don't want to lose what we have now. And every Western movie is always about, every futurist sci-fi is a dystopia. Right. And it's important to Greek storytelling that there has to be a rising action but the solution's never futurism in the futurist movie.
I know. So, I don't understand how that's predictive programming to get us to like accept. I mean,
well, it's not.
I know that they use
it's to get us to be afraid of the future so we accept a reset. It's
okay. All right. That makes that's interesting. Again, it goes back to those naturalists versus futurists, right?
Yeah, and
where does Klaus come from? He comes from the north, where all these heathen, pagan traditions come from, right? I mean, I'm not trying to associate him directly with that, but
his name Sawabi has to do with the god of Turan as well.
Oh, how about that?
There is some interesting connection between Turanism and, Schwab mentioned Tartaria. I have to find someone asking me for the clip, and I saw it.
Yeah, I'd love to see it too, because I've heard rumors, but that's ridiculous that it's that out in the open in the WEF now.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always been accepted in Eastern Europe as a thing, and they talked in that show, Servant of the People, the Ukrainian show Zelensky, which is now the political party's name. They talk about we've dealt with the Tartars and the fascists, and like it comes up like all the time. Like sorry, go ahead. Oh no, go ahead. Say yours.
I was just thinking, like, for a while I was kind of suspicious around how Tartaria is coming out. I think I mentioned it on that round table that it's like, well, were they a one world government? And it's like, well, maybe not a one world government or whatever. Maybe I'm framing it the wrong way, but are we witnessing the ultimate rollout of this old empire? And it's not what we're hoping it is.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, he doesn't mention it in a positive light, so that kind of helps. And
right.
In general, the Tartars are looked at in a more Eurocentristic, with more Eurocentricity. Tartars are looked at as the hordes with horseback. They're very closely associated with the Moorish Muslims that took over Spain. You have these statues in Leon of cutting off the heads of Tartars that were coming in from the east. So there's a lot of hate on the Tartars by I don't really, and this is also why they've said for so long that it wasn't an advanced civilization, but it was just sort of a group, of campers that got together on the weekends and killed people, and they didn't really. Yeah, I mean, the way Tartaria was described before it was described as Atlantis was they lived up to their knees in mud. They didn't have they don't have lights in the nighttime. Yeah, they lived in tar, and we see this like over and over again. The Tartarians are described as the worst possible, lowest people in morals and dogma. It says, well, the Tartars, they lost, Albert Pike from the Freemasons says they lost their lands because they were inept. It's nepotism. They didn't deserve it. And so it's the worst possible story, but it's everyone's story. The people that say, hey, we built the pyramids. We understand how they built the pyramids. We're connected with the magic of electricity and science. And we know about Tartaria. and they lost it because they didn't deserve it. They didn't work hard enough.
That is really interesting. So it's like a hubris, and that is the Atlantis story.
That's okay. So here's the biggest answer I think I've gotten to your question about, is Tartaria evil or is it good?
Yeah, I was just beating around that bush all the time.
let's just go let's go straight to the thing, is that Atlanticism and Tartarianism are their opponents. And so this idea that Tartaria existed was believed by a number of people, despite the fact that they were told it wasn't true in the Rosicrucians and the Freemason period, and they continued to look into it. While at the same time, Atlanticism is the belief that we are building Atlantis now. It's not so much that Atlantis existed in the past. It kind of is. It's in the vague memory, but it's not Tartaria, decidedly. They've decided to refer to it as the one world Tartaria, the one world Atlantis. And and this idea that Atlantis is what we're building now. New Atlantis is what Bacon calls it. New Utopia is also associated with this idea of Atlantis. So I would say Atlanticism is actually the more true element of evil described by Schwab and described in the World Economic Forum and the Club of Rome. And even when you think about the differences between Carthage and Rome, right? Rome and Carthage were, Rome had this seafaring empire that spread everywhere. Yeah. Carthage had to go north. So the land that Carthage controlled, the Club of Rome, land in the sea, man. Yeah, land in the sea.
Just goes back
to
Jordan Maxwell, God bless you.
It's like that Civilization video game, land in the sea.
Dude. Man, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about so many different items like this. That's how my brain works. I know it's how yours works too. So
dude, this is great. Yeah. I love doing shows with you. It's great to just jump around,
Yeah, man. I mean, it's all touching on similar things, it's all leading to the central focus always anyway. That's just, we're uncovering more and more of what we used to maybe understand. I don't know. Maybe we're going to understand more than any generation ever has. I don't know, but I know that we're just trying to do this for good. So that's what I like. And I appreciate you coming on, man, always. And let the people know if they don't already. My God, I don't know who doesn't, but where can they find you?
Andreas.me, Xirtus.com. And if your name is Andrew or Andreas or Andy, then you can join the Council of Andrews.
Hell yeah, man. All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining me and Andreas. And join us next time. Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deep Share Podcast. If you want to hear more, then hit that subscribe button. Follow me on all the social places. And remember, think for yourself, but don't always believe what you think. Till next time.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, Tartaria. Enough, I get the point.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
What do we know? What do we know? If I know what we know, then I can tell you what we know, and if someone else knows, okay?